All right, we're live. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Mission Top. Mission Top is a place, it's a farmstead and ranch, it's a family, it is a kingdom, it is a world, you could say, and it is a process. And today, it's also a place of ideas, I guess I should say, and that's why we're here doing this live stream. And today we will be talking and continuing to talk about The Unsettling of America, which is a book by Wendell Berry. And yesterday we started this. If you wanted to catch the first chapter of the book and our discussion of that, today we'll be moving on to the second chapter, which I think is equally as potent for those of you that were here yesterday and enjoyed that first set of ideas from Berry. A few things. You can see I'm in a little bit different setting today. As I said a few days ago, we just barely got about 180 chicks, and we have to brood them. And so they are in the shop where I was filming previously, and so I kind of got kicked out. And I had a nice little setup going there. So in making my new setup here, it's a little bit less ideal. I'm still working on the lighting and things like that. So if it's not quite as visually appealing, I apologize about that. Of course, mainly you have to stare at me anyway, which I also apologize about. That's maybe the worst part of live streaming, is that just to make sure that I'm here getting and the live stream is working, I actually have to have an image of me in front of me the whole time, which is so unnatural. And I think in this time of COVID, where everybody's gone to so much Zoom meetings and things like that, has been something that a lot of people have realized is not a good thing, to have an image of yourself in front of you while you're talking. It just takes a lot of getting used to, and it's still something that I am not used to. So with that said, let's talk a little bit about this thumbnail. Martin is already on here in the chat saying that you liked the thumbnail. I'm glad you appreciated that. Kind of came together this morning as I was thinking of the best way to frame what we're going to be talking about today in this chapter from Berry. You know, I've picked a little bit on Fauci in a few of my streams. I don't have anything against him. It's the most prominent example of today of what we do with our experts today, and how we treat them, and how we sometimes refer to them as if they can do much more than they've ever been trained to do in their expertise. And that was certainly the case with Fauci and COVID, where because we want somebody to tell us what's going on and what's to do, and our mentality says turn to experts in anything. He was the best expert we could find, but at the end of the day, as we're going to talk about in this discussion, the last person you want kind of being the biggest figure in a time of something as far-reaching as COVID, which wasn't just and isn't just a health issue, but touched all aspects of society. The last thing you want is an expert that has a particular expertise and looks at the world in only that particular way. And so we'll talk about why that's the case today. But so that we don't just have to have the spirit of Fauci hanging over us this entire time, I'd rather get us back to kind of the spirit of Wendell Berry hanging over us. So I'm going to put that image up here as we dive into his book. Again, this is The Unsettling of America. And today we're going to do largely the same thing we did yesterday. Again, this chapter is even shorter than yesterday's, so hopefully we'll get through with even less length. But I'm going to mainly rely on his words. I don't usually do that when I suggest books. I'll usually just take little quotes and passages. But I find Berry to be such a potent writer that it's a disservice to try to summarize his words, because you'll just say things not as well as he does, right? And so instead, I am going to just rely on his words. Martin says, is the stream lagging on here? You'll have to tell me if anything is not working quite right. I do have my microphone set up a little bit differently, so if you think maybe the audio is not quite matched up with the video, let me know that. I can always just go off of my main mic and go to more of the mic that's on my computer. If I need to, that for sure will work. So let me know if something seems off on the thumbnail, and I will do that. But for this point, I'm just going to keep on going on and then see what you guys say in the meantime. So, okay. So the way that he frames this chapter, that he calls it, is the ecological crisis as a crisis of character. And again, that didn't quite grab me as much as what I think he actually focuses mostly on, which is this focus on expertise and specialization in societies. And so I decided to title it about specialization. Okay, looks like Martin says video is off sometimes, but audio is fine. And I apologize about that. Today, maybe if things aren't working, we'll just rely on the audio as long as that's good, because it's the most important part anyway. And I should say with that, just to add in, I've gotten a few requests to put these into podcast form, which I very much agree with. I mean, that's probably the best format for what I actually do here. I'll still record them live with the video, but I'm going to work and try to get all these uploaded in podcast form. It's not that difficult. It just takes some time. And I want to do that because I know that for these an hour and a half and 2 hour long lengths that sometimes we get into, it's a lot easier to digest them and to be able to listen to them while riding in a car or doing something rather than just sitting in front of a screen for that long a time. So I want to just express that I'm sensitive to that, and I've heard those of you that have suggested that, and I'm working on it and just haven't gotten there quite yet. Okay, in this chapter, Berry opens up by criticizing essentially the Sierra Club, and I'm going to jump over this portion and just summarize this portion, because what he does is say that when he was writing this, again, back in 1977, so he's citing an event in 1975, it had been found out that the Sierra Club, who is an environmental organization, for those of you that don't know, probably the most prominent one, or one of the most prominent ones here in the United States, maybe even in the world, it was found out that they had invested heavily in a lot of kind of the worst polluters and worst corporations or entities that were degrading the environment. And so he opens up by pointing that out and asking, why is it the case that we find that often, right? He says they were making convenience of enterprises that they knew to be morally and even practically indefensible. He says we are dealing then with an absurdity that is not a quirk or an accident, but is fundamental to our character as a people. The split between what we think and what we do is profound. Okay? And this kind of frames the whole discussion, that there is this recurring thing in humanity that we know things to be right, we think a certain way and espouse a certain set of ideas, and then we don't act that way. So why is that the case? It says, it is not just possible, it is altogether to be expected that our society would produce conservationists who invest in strip mining companies. And that's what they'd find out with the Sierra Company. Just as it must inevitably produce asthmatic executives whose industries pollute the air, and vice presidents of pesticide corporations whose children are dying of cancer. And these people will tell you that this is the way the real world works. They will pride themselves on their sacrifices for our standard of living. They will call themselves practical men and hard-headed realists. And they will have their justifications in abundance from intellectuals, college professors, clergymen, politicians, the viciousness of a mentality that can look complacently upon disease as part of the cost would be obvious to any child. But this is the realism of millions of modern adults. There is no use pretending that the contradictions between what we think or say and what we do is a limited phenomenon. There is no group of the extra intelligent or extra concerned or extra virtuous that is exempt. I cannot think of any American whom I know of or have heard of who is not contributing in some way to destruction. And there's a point worth pausing on, right? I mean, myself, yourself, virtually everyone I know, this is the predicament that we're in, right? That we all know that in some way, the way that we live our lives is destroying something, right? Especially, we know that the way of life that modern society is living is unsustainable. We know that, the things that we're doing, whether it's our use of chemicals, whether it's the way that we obtain our food, we know, we've seen the documentaries. If you paid any attention to anything, we know that it's degrading, and yet we still have to proceed doing it anyways. Why is that the case, and what to do about it? The reason is simple. To live indestructibly in an economy that is overwhelmingly destructive would require any one of us or any small group of us a great deal more work than we have yet been able to do. How could we divorce ourselves completely and yet responsibly from the technologies and powers that are destroying our planet? The answer is not yet thinkable, and it will not be thinkable for some time, even though there are now groups and families and persons everywhere in the country who have begun the labor of thinking it. So again, it bears worth mentioning again that he was writing this in 1977. This was very much a problem then, and it's funny how much his words just ring completely true today. And he's recognizing the predicament. I'm sure he would even say it of himself, that the way that our society has been set up, there's no way any of us can escape living a life that is in some way destroying things that are valuable around us, destroying beauty, destroying different facets of nature or the earth, things that we know that we value, but you can't just step out of it so easy. It takes tremendous work. And like he says, we haven't yet been willing as a society to do the work. It says, and so we are by no means divided or readily divisible into environmental saints and sinners, right? And that's the thing of like the environmental movement that oftentimes bugs us, right? People acting like they're so virtuous when all of us are, there's not this division, right? All of us are the sinners in terms of, the environment. But there are legitimate distinctions that need to be made. There are distinctions of degree and of consciousness. Some people are less destructive than others, and some are more conscious of their destructiveness than others. For some, their involvement in pollution, soil depletion, strip mining, deforestation, industrial and commercial waste is simply a practical compromise, a necessary reality, the price of modern comfort and convenience. For others, this list of involvements is an agenda for thought and work that will produce remedies. People who thus set their lives against destruction have necessarily confronted in themselves the absurdity that they have recognized in their society. They have first observed the tendency of modern organizations to perform in opposition to their stated purposes. They have seen governments that exploit and oppress the people they are sworn to serve and protect, medical procedures that produce ill health, schools that preserve ignorance, methods of transportation that, as Ivan Illich says, have created more distances than they bridge. And they have seen that these public absurdities are and can be no more than the aggregate result of private absurdities. The corruption of community has its source in the corruption of character. This realization has become the typical moral crisis of our time. Once our personal connection to what is wrong becomes clear, then we have to choose. We can go on as before, recognizing our dishonesty and living with it as best we can, or we can begin the effort to change the way we think and live. Okay, and so here he's making this transition, and here's where it gets really good in the following things. But the first thing to say is that, for those people that want to get out of this destructive process, he's saying, he recognizes there are those people. Hopefully you're them. I certainly am trying. That is what Mission Top is about, is trying to get into the work that it takes to get out of that destructive process. One of the things that you notice is how many institutions around us, like he says, work against their stated principles. And he's talking in 1977, but boy, have we seen this in the last few years, whether it's government, religion, corporations. You see so many instances where it comes out that these institutions were working like exactly opposed to their stated purposes. Something like Google saying their purpose of not being evil, right? And then you see them taking actions and aligning themselves with forces or treating people and in terms of psychological manipulations and the products and things like that look an awful lot like something evil. Obviously, government and even religions, the things that have come out, happening within religions that have been covered up and this and that, it's the same kind of thing. So again, he's very much a prophet, somebody that saw patterns already going on and was kind of ahead of his time even in knowing how much these patterns were going to continue. And here's where he gets into what he sees as one of the major sources of these problems, and that's where we get the specialization. He says, the disease of the modern character is specialization. Looked at from the standpoint of the social system, the aim of specialization may seem desirable enough. The aim is to see that the responsibilities of government, law, medicine, engineering, agriculture, education, etc., are given into the hands of the most skilled, best prepared people. The difficulties do not appear until we look at specialization from the opposite standpoint, that of the individual persons. We then begin to see the grotesquerie, indeed the impossibility, of an idea of community wholeness that divorces itself from any idea of personal wholeness. So, on the surface, specialization, we know why we do it. We want experts in fields dealing with things because they're better at it, right? It makes perfect sense. And he says, so from a societal standpoint, it makes sense. But he says, flip it to the personal standpoint, and here's where it becomes, like he says, grotesque. Because you realize in order for somebody to become a specialist, to focus that much and get that good, it means that they have to start looking at the world as a person in a less holistic manner. And so suddenly you have communities of individuals who cannot look at the world in a whole manner. Continuing, it says, the first and best known hazard of the specialist system is that it produces specialists. And these are some of the genius lines of him, right? The first and best known hazard of the specialist system is that it produces specialists. People who are elaborately and expensively trained to do one thing. We get into absurdity very quickly here. There are, for instance, educators who have nothing to teach, communicators who have nothing to say, medical doctors skilled at expensive cures for diseases that they have no skill and no interest in preventing. I think that doctor one is one of the best examples, because when you're a specialist, designed at curing diseases, then all your interests are actually for the disease not to be prevented, right? You make your money off it being cured over and over again. So these specializations can very quickly, again, warp incentive systems, and you'd like to think that people can kind of move beyond that, but man, you just have to be participating in the world to realize that your dentist needs to find things wrong in your mouth, right, in order to make their money, and they do, right, and stuff comes out that finds out that yes, there are things that are overdiagnosed, tests done that don't need to be done. Why? Because these people worked very hard, right, to get their specialization. They sacrificed a lot, and there's expectations there. The whole reason anybody does it, of course, usually at the end of the day, is because they want this high standard of living, and we'll get into that. Focused around money. More common and more damaging are the inventors, manufacturers, and salesmen of devices who have no concern for the possible effects of those devices. Specialization is thus seen to be a way of institutionalizing, justifying, and paying highly for a calamitous disintegration and scattering out of the various functions of character, which are workmanship, care, conscience, responsibility. Another one to think of is fast food, right? We would praise kind of the person that makes a fast food restaurant, or even just any restaurant you could think of, for being industrious, for working hard. But at the end of the day, so many restaurants, especially fast food ones, we know make things worse off, right? And so the person that does that, right, in their specialization of making this certain kind of fast food restaurant, they have to, not look beyond their expertise, and not look and face the fact that what they have created, despite the fact that people are coming, paying for it, making money, is actually making most people's lives worse off, right? And it's amazing how many people who grow up with a value system, with principles and things like that, once they get into their specialization, will kind of turn into specialist mode and justify those very things. Well, I've got to provide for my family, right? And and something like fast food, well, certain people need meals, and they don't have time to prepare them, and I'm just doing something. I don't expect people to be eating this all the time, of course. I'm just providing a very convenient service. These are the kinds of things that people very easily do to get themselves out of that burden of having to realize that what they're doing is actually destructive, right? And if anything, I think his points here only get better. This is maybe my favorite part. Even worse, a system of specialization requires the abdication to specialists of various competences and responsibilities that were once personal and universal. Thus, the average, one is tempted to say the ideal, American citizen, now consigns the problem of food production to agriculturalists and agribusinessmen, the problem of health to doctors and sanitation experts, the problems of education to school teachers and educators, the problems of conservation to conservationists, and so on. This supposedly fortunate citizen is therefore left with only two concerns: making money and entertaining himself. So again, we know why they're specialists, right? We know that there's efficiencies there. We know that there's certain people, we send our kids off to the elementary school teacher because that person's trained to do that. They have the curriculum, they have the expertise, they have the time, etc. But in doing that, what does that leave us doing? Making money and entertaining ourselves. And if you think about if you really get down to watching what people do for most of their day, it's making money and entertaining themselves. He earns money typically, so he's talking about this American, prototypical citizen. He earns money typically as a specialist. So pretty much everybody's a specialist today. He earns money typically as a specialist working an 8-hour day at a job for the quality or consequences of which somebody else, or perhaps more typically nobody else, will be responsible. And not surprisingly, since he can do little else for himself, he is even unable to entertain himself. This is great. He's even unable to entertain himself. For there exists an enormous industry of exorbitantly expensive specialists whose purpose is to entertain him. The beneficiary of this regime of specialists ought to be the happiest of mortals, or so we were expected to believe. All of his vital concerns are in the hands of certified experts. He is a certified expert himself, and as such, he earns more money in a year than all his great-grandparents put together. And that's another one of these stark facts that's true, right? Each of us, anybody has a university degree, that's gotten a degree which by its very nature, a university degree specializes you, right? Or puts you into a job by which very much you are going to be trained as a specialist in your job. There are benefits. You are making very likely more money than all your great-grandparents. Let's see, that's 8 people used to make all the way put together, right? So we know why this has happened. Between stints at his job, he has nothing to do but mow his lawn with a sit-down lawnmower or watch other certified experts on television. At supper time, he may eat a tray of ready-prepared food, which he and his wife, also a certified expert, procure at the cost only of money, transportation, and the pushing of a button. So, and he's obviously kind of alluding to the TV dinner, which were kind of popular at the time, but today it's just turned into eating out. The amount of people that, at the convenience of getting in your car, driving to a drive-through, talking, exchanging a little money, boom, there's your meal. And how many meals do we get that way, right? For a few minutes between supper and sleep, he may catch a glimpse of his children, who since breakfast have been in the care of education experts, basketball or marching band experts, or perhaps legal experts. And isn't that the case with children today? It's from one expert at school to another expert in this class to another expert over here. The fact is, however, that this is probably the most unhappy average citizen in the history of the world. He has not the power to provide himself with anything but money, and his money is inflating like a balloon and drifting away, subject to historical circumstances and the power of other people. So, think about what money has become today. I mean, we all know that money is based on, these days, an idea, right? It's paper or it's digital accounts in an account, which basically all rely on a kind of what Yuval Harari, if that's his name, in the book *Sapiens* calls a collective fiction, right? That it has money, it has value because we believe it has value. And even things like Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies, it's the same thing. I mean, we've given these means of being values and systems of exchange, but at the end of the day, how much control do you have over what that value is going to be? Our money is completely beholden to all these other forces of which we have no control over. And contrast that to other things that you have that have inherent worth. I've gotten a few of them here, on Mission Top, like a sheep. A sheep at the very least has an inherent worth. It is food. It can produce more sheep. It can produce wool, etc. And you contrast that to the money that's sitting there in your bank account, and it's quite the different thing that has happened with money, right? And so in being an expert in things, mainly you're getting that kind of money in your bank account, the fictional kind, the collective fictional kind. Of course, you can turn it in to tangible things, and these days I would recommend that you do. But at the end of the day, you have to recognize that most of us still have that kind of money in our accounts. I do too, and we have very little control over how much it's worth. Okay, from morning to night, he does not touch anything that he has produced himself. And that's another one worth saying again. From morning to night, he does not touch anything that he has produced himself. So touch anything. A lot of knowledge workers, you might produce something, an email or something as part of your work. You might attend meetings and you make your work through your voice and through your ideas. And, that's all fine and good. I'm a big believer in ideas, as you can see just from doing this. But there's something missing in our lives when everything that we can touch around us, we have not produced, right? There's something that is inherently, like he says, more something you can be proud about when you can look at it, grasp it, touch it. For all his leisure and recreation, he feels bad. He looks bad. He is overweight. His health is poor. His air, water, and food are all known to contain poisons. There's a fair chance that he will die of suffocation. He suspects that his love life is not as fulfilling as other people's. He wishes that he had been born sooner or later. He does not know why his children are the way they are. He does not understand what they say. He does not care much and does not know why he does not care. He does not know what his wife wants or what he wants. Certain advertisements and pictures in magazines make him suspect that he is basically unattractive. He feels that all his possessions are under threat of pillage. He does not know what he would do if he lost his job, if the economy failed, if the utility companies failed, if the police went on strike, if the truckers went on strike, if his wife left him, if his children ran away, if he should be found to be incurably ill. And for these anxieties, of course, he consults certified experts, who in turn consult certified experts about their anxieties. Again, 1977, but just as applicable 44 years later, right? This is us. These words are so potent, so searing, because you're like, yeah, that's us. How many of us know that? And he's going to get into this, that we're utterly helpless in the world. We have this expertise, but outside of that, we can do almost nothing, right? And no wonder people are anxious. That anxiety is like one of the most common and prevalent notions out in society right now, right? It is rarely considered that this average citizen is anxious because he ought to be. So he's saying, no wonder we're anxious. We ought to be, given the position that we've put ourselves in, right? Because he still has some gumption that he has not yet given up in deference to the experts. He ought to be anxious because he is helpless. That he is dependent upon so many specialists, the beneficiary of so much expert help, can only mean that he is a captive, a potential victim. If he lives by the competence of so many other people, then he lives also by their indulgence. His own will and his own reason to live are made subordinate to the mere tolerance of everybody else. He has one chance to live, what he conceives to be his life, his own small specialty within a delicate, tense, everywhere strained system of specialists. And so, at some point we realize we are utterly beholden on all sorts of other people to for everything, for our food, for our clothing, for even, today, how many people are going to therapy? We can't even solve our problems without enlisting a specialist. We can't even be married without somebody to counsel us, a specialist on how to counsel us in our marriage. I mean, that is a precarious situation to be in. And, admittedly, very much the reason that I'm here, that one of the reasons why COVID was a catalyst to drive my family and I to Mission Top, something we'd been thinking about for a very long time, but there COVID makes it so stark. Like, and I'm sitting there, again, COVID hadn't even hit, but I'm looking and saying to myself, there's a possibility, right, that a pandemic, if it, let's say, it was only 3% or less of people dying, but, I know enough about viruses, and most of us do, to know that things can mutate. What if it became 20%? 20% of people die, and suddenly what's to say that you'll have enough of the people to keep the power grid running, right? Power grid goes out. Are you prepared to live in a world with no power grid, that something like that out, because that enough people have died, that there's no longer enough people to support it, because there's only so many specialists that know how to keep like something like that going, right? So this is the stuff that was going through my mind and kind of running through the scenario. Okay, power grid goes out, communication goes out, supply chains go out. Okay, what if my valley had to do without food? Well, I was living in Utah. My culture had a good sense of having some sort of food preparation, food storage away. So certainly people would live for a time. But, I had to ask, what if a pandemic like this brought the whole system down? The whole global supply kind of system, and places within 6 months to a year had to rely on their own locale to generate their food, right? One of the worst places you could be in that kind of scenario is like a city in the arid, dry desert, of the United States, where water is very difficult to come by. You can't just up and grow crops, automatically. You're relying on the fact that water will just come out in unlimited fashion out of your hose and things like that, right? And so these are the scenarios that we're going through my mind, saying, wow, like, look how utterly exposed we are. The feasibility of having my, culture, my valley, grow its own food was extremely unlikely. I'm sure people can survive for a time, and maybe they would just leave. And that's when I had to say, well, am I ready to leave? Could I live indefinitely if I had to move, to just up and go? These are the kind of things to think of. It sounds very apocalyptic and things like that, but having just gone through a pandemic, we were lucky it was, only at the end of the day, it's, very small amount of people that dying. Again, just play out if a pandemic came and it was 10% or 20% of people that were dying, and see if, which is a very real possibility, see if you're ready to live in that world, right? And so those are the things going through my mind that drove me then to say, like, yeah, I'm utterly helpless as a person, and I don't want to be anymore. So I've got to do something about it. But hopefully, if you know me, not in that survivalist, prepper kind of way, which, they have their virtues because they're seeing the same things, but there are ways in which you can go almost too specialist into that, right? You have to be working in the bigger picture of making yourself sovereign, again, I guess you'd say, while still building a beautiful world around you. And that's, ultimately the answer. All right, a little aside there, but I just want to kind of take the reason I think we when we are sitting there in bed at night as a society, might feel anxious about a few things, the way that we've set things up, Okay. From a public point of view, the specialist system is a failure because though everything is done by an expert, very little is done well. Our typical industrial or professional product is both ingenious and shoddy. The specialist system fails from a personal point of view because a person who can do only one thing can do virtually nothing for himself. In living in the world by his own will and skill, the stupidest peasant or tribesman is more competent than the most intelligent worker or technician or intellectual in a society of specialists. So as a society of specialists, we're extremely powerful, right? But you take that society out of its normal operations just a little bit, yeah, and you are filled with millions of people who are the stupidest peasant or tribesman in the regular history of the world would be much more competent than. What happens under the rule of specialization is that though society becomes more and more intricate, it has less and less structure. It becomes more and more organized, but less and less orderly. The community disintegrates because it loses the necessary understandings, forms, and enactments of the relations among materials and processes, principles and actions, ideals and realities, past and present and future, men and women. And hopefully, again, those who regularly listen to me, you'll see how many of these are masculine, feminine dichotomies. Body and spirit, city and country, civilization and wilderness, growth and decay, life and death. Just as the individual character loses the sense of a responsible involvement in these relations, no longer does human life rise from the earth like a pyramid, broadly and considerately founded upon its sources. Now it scatters itself out in reckless horizontal sprawl, like a disorderly city whose suburbs and pavements destroy the fields. So here's something very weird about humanity, right? And he just put it in his last sentences. We actually construct our societies, our physical buildings and societies in relation to each other along our value systems, right? So it's no wonder that a medieval city would be constructed something like this image that I like to bring up of Jonathan Pajot's, where there was a wall around it. Outside of the city, you would have the unknown, chaotic things, barbarian lands, etc. Inside the city, you would have something like a pyramidal structure, something that's built off of its base of the people surrounding a center where you have the core central things that make that society or city a city, which generally was the government, generally the church, right, the public square. And then you would have oftentimes even concentric rings of streets that would emanate out of that center, which, people and shops and things like that would build on. So it grows out of, chaos, you could say, the unknown and those things beyond the walls, and is formed by people, that all culminate in an identity of who we are as a common people, our values, our purposes, etc. So that's the way a city used to be built. And today, how is it built? Like he said, this sprawl out there with no center, nothing to pull it together, nothing to define, a lot of suburb cities, you can't tell where one starts and where the other begins. You can't tell where some neighborhoods begin and other ones don't, unless they're walled neighborhoods, that a lot of places have. But you just have an ongoing pattern, repeating pattern of big box stores, strip malls, restaurants, things. And you say, where's the center of this? For a while, it was the shopping mall, right? And even that has fallen out. So we built our societies around our value system, like it says, because, in this world of specialists, you no longer have to take into account, the basis of what you are and who you are. Here's a good example. I brought up this book, Holistic Management. I'm even thinking of, let me go get it, in fact. Okay, Holistic Management, Alan Savory, another excellent book. And the whole basis of this book was, it was saying we have to get back to managing everything, our lives, our companies, our governments, holistically, where he's saying you have to, at every step, think of the quality of the soil in the world, the water cycle, the mineral cycle. You have to think, what are your primary values you're trying to achieve in that process, and then manage your life around that. And so you contrast that to you, like, when's the last time you thought of, oh, how is the way I'm living my life affecting the mineral cycle? What is even the mineral cycle? But why is that important? Because it turns out the mineral cycle has to do with making sure that you actually have sustenance, back in front of you. And so you can see that in our society, we've made it so people don't have to think about these kinds of holistic considerations. Instead, we just focus in on what? Making money, entertaining ourselves, and at the end of the day, we assume these things. There must be experts that are thinking of these things, but guess what? The experts are only thinking of their little narrow domain of what they've been trained to think about. And as we brought out in the episode about the need for something more like philosopher kings in society, people that have philosophia, right, a love of wisdom, which definitely entails a holistic look at the world. Where are those people? We haven't trained them. We haven't valued them. My message is, if you and I aren't trying to be those people, who is going to be those kind of people? Obviously, I'm exaggerating. There are a lot of people that are seeing this problem, and they are trying to look at the world more this way. But in general, right, this has been the problem with society, is that nobody is thinking of the more holistic considerations, because we don't have to, right? Okay, the concept of country, homeland, dwelling place becomes simplified as the environment. That is what surrounds us. Once we see our place, our part of the world as surrounding us, we have already made a profound division between it and ourselves. We have given up the understanding, dropped it out of our language, and so out of our thought, that we and our country create one another, depend on one another. Are literally part of one another. That our land passes in and out of our bodies, just as our bodies pass in and out of our land. That as we and our land are part of one another, so all who are living as neighbors here, human and plant and animal, are part of one another, and so cannot possibly flourish alone. That, therefore, our culture must be our response to our place. Our culture and our place are images of each other and inseparable from each other, and so neither can be better than the other. Because by definition, they lack any sense of mutuality or wholeness. Our specializations subsist on conflict with one another. Okay, so while I was reading that, I saw, Martin, your comment popped up. What are we to do then? What is the solution? I think this his last paragraph is the solution. Like, we are trained to think that, well, there's got to be a political solution. There's got to be some institution we could begin, and that institution will bring about this solution. But he just gave us the solution. We have to, starting with ourselves, and then training our children, and then emanating out from there, we have to reconfigure the way that we think about ourselves and the world. And that's what I've been getting at in this fractal way of looking at the world. We have to see, first of all, that we're composed of many things. We're a world unto ourselves. Then we see, okay, we are one thing, but then we are not just one thing. We are part of our family, right? We are part of this bigger whole thing of a family, and we should not see so much of a division between us and the family. The family is a being, a living, breathing being, and we are part of it, right? And if that's the case, then who yourself, your family, and the place around you, the grass out on your lawn, the air that you're breathing, the insects buzzing around, those are all part of you as well. Why? Because you cannot live without them. You're all one, whole thing. And a lot of these things can't live, without other things around them. The whole system is bound up as one living, breathing system. And so you have to take care of you, right? You have to take care of the thing that will ultimately nourish you. You have to take care of the ground, because essentially the ground produces things that you eat and then go back to the ground, and you have to make sure that cycle is working. That regenerative cycle is working within you. You're part of it. You're attached to it. It is you. You are it, kind of thing. And very quickly this can sound all again, new agey and that kind of thing, but that's why I like to look at it in terms of kingdoms. I think kingdom is a lot better way of looking at it. And so when you see yourself in this fractal way as a kingdom within a kingdom within a kingdom, then you see that, you are part of the body of innumerable other kingdoms, and you've got to be able to jump from those different ways of looking at things. Why? because then you'll start acting. Once you know that you're part of other things, you'll say, why would I hurt myself, right? And so just naturally, you start to look at the world in ways and saying, oh, I've got to stop hurting myself. How can I do that? And you start into that process, okay? So again, I think the solutions, Martin, do emanate out from us. Like that's the only place to start, is that individual people have to start living this way. And the nice part about it is it's more compelling. It is more beautiful. It is more attractive. And so enough people start living this way. And you can't do it cold turkey. Like I've said, I need 3 to 5 years at least to get to the point where I'm mostly living in this way. But the more people that say, okay, I'm starting now, and let me pick what I can do around me today or this week, and you build from there, right? Yeah, then you give it 3 to 5 years, you give it a decade, and more people are living that way. It's more beautiful, it's more attractive, more people start doing the same. And it's the very reason I'm doing this. You'll have shown people along the way, yourself, your neighbors, how to do it, right? Not by forcing them to do anything, not by imposing some political solution that makes everybody do something a certain way, but simply showing that it's better. And people look and say, oh yeah, that is more beautiful, that is better, and they do it. That's how I think the only way this realistically works. The thing that makes it awfully nice that I'm still searching for is I so much wish there was 1, 2, 3 other families like us close by me around doing this. That would make it so much more easy and to collaborate and to work together to do it. So if you ever find this attractive and are trying to build that kind of solution, the more you could arrange a scenario like that, the better. And we're kind of praying that somehow becomes the case. There are definitely people around us that are growing into this, but there's not a lot of people that are kind of all in the way that we are. So, okay. And again, thanks, Martin, for your comments. Anybody else that's on there, feel free. Questions, comments, please participate. You're always welcome to do so. Okay, the rule is never to cooperate. So he's talking about, under specialization, the rule is to never cooperate, but rather to follow one's own interest as far as possible. Checks and balances are all applied externally by opposition, never by self-restraint. Labor, management, the military, the government, etc. never forbear until their excesses arouse enough opposition to force them to do so. The good of the whole of creation, the world and all of its creatures together, is never a consideration because it is never thought of. Our culture now simply lacks the means for thinking of it. We train ourselves not to think in terms of wholes, right? It is for this reason that none of our basic problems is ever solved. Indeed, it is for this reason that our basic problems are getting worse. The specialists are profiting too well from the symptoms, evidently, to be concerned about cures. Again, that's so like such the sinister part of it. In being a specialist, you very often profit from not solving underlying problems, right? Because you've specialized yourself at dealing with the problem, not solving it, and you're making a lot of money in the process. Just as the myth of imminent cure by some breakthrough of science or technology is so lucrative and all-justifying as to foreclose any possibility of an interest in prevention. The problems thus become the stock in trade of specialists. The so-called professions survive by endlessly processing and talking about problems that they have neither the will nor the competence to solve. The doctor who is interested in disease but not in health is clearly in the same category with the conservationist who invests in the destruction of what he otherwise intends to preserve. They both have the comfort of job security, but at the cost of ultimate futility. One of the most troubling characteristics of the specialist mentality is its use of money as a kind of proxy, its willingness to transmute the powers and functions of life into money. Time is money is one of its axioms and the source of many evils, among them the waste of both time and money. Akin to the idea that time is money is the concept less spoken, but is commonly assumed that we may be adequately represented by money. The giving of money has thus become our characteristic virtue. And I'm sure you notice that. You start turning everything into something that's exchangeable into money, right? And something is lost in there in terms of what ultimately is valuable. We tend to think that, yeah, money, everything can be valued in terms of money. We're taught that kind of in economics and whatnot, but it breaks down at certain levels, and gives us incentives to act in ways, again, that forego the values that cannot be captured by money. Okay. But to give is not to do. The money is given in lieu of action, though care time. Oh, the money is given in lieu of action, thought, care, time. Right? My wife and I were just talking about this because we have two wedding invitations to former soccer players that I coached, and our initial thought was, we're here in another state, we'll just send them some money. Money's the most useful thing they could use starting out in as being newlyweds. And then I read these words, which reminded me, because it's so easy to get in this mentality that to just send that money, is in lieu of action, thought, care, or time. And what would actually be more effective to give to these former players of mine? And it is no remedy for the fragmentation of character and consciousness that is the consequence of specialization. At the simplest, most practical level, it would be difficult for most of us to give enough in donations to good causes to compensate for, much less remedy, the damage done by the money that is taken from us and used destructively by various agencies of the government and by the corporations that hold us in captive dependence on their products. More important, even if we could give enough to overbalance the official and corporate misuse of our money, we would still not solve the problem. The willingness to be represented by money involves a submission to the modern divisions of character and community. The remedy safeguards the disease. This has become, to some extent at least, an argument against institutional solutions. Such solutions necessarily fail to solve the problems to which they are addressed, because by definition they cannot consider the real causes. The only real practical, hope-giving way to remedy the fragmentation that is the disease of the modern spirit is a small and humble way. A way that a government or agency or organization or institution will never think of, though a person may think of it. One must begin in one's own life the private solutions that can only in turn become public solutions. So, Martin followed up, and I think, again, he's hitting some of the most important points with this. He followed up with, if one does not have family and is alone, do you believe one should start pursuing such a life? And so, I would say exactly what he kind of just said right there. My answer would be yes, but you do it in the, at the level that you can, and to the degree that you can, and you just start saying, what can I do, right? And that may be as simple, it's as simple as starting to grow a little bit of food for yourself or something like that. And lots of people in the world have shown that you can do that even in the most urban environments. You do that, and it automatically, you're now in touch with a whole other, world of cycles and the earth and the way that these generativity from the earth works. And so automatically that's changed the way that you're going to then look out to the world for the rest of the things that you do. I mean, that's just a small example, but my point is that, you do what you can where you can, and you grow out from there. That, to me, that's always the solution. That's always what ends up changing the world the most. You start with a little seed, a little spark, and you let that grow from there. And the cool thing is, this is where you get to kind of the meta game and the whole things I was talking about there, that heaven exists in the process, right? There is no destination. There's no final, finally, if I get mission top to a place where this is happening and this and this and this, then it is perfectly beautiful, and then we'll stop because we'll have achieved what we were set out to achieve. No, it doesn't work that way. You enter into the most fulfilling heavenly feelings and state just when you're making progress, right? When you set out a higher ideal and then you make progress towards it, meaningful progress towards it. So that's where, the the wonderful thing about this is that you start wherever you can, and you'll reap the same rewards, at least in terms of meaning and fulfillment that somebody is that's living in this some idyllic, beautiful setting, and off grid, and with a beautiful village and community around them. That's just done this to such a greater degree with old world culinary traditions and delicious things to eat and feasts and all that. I mean, that sounds great, right? But the cool thing is, once you've gotten there, that just kind of becomes the norm, and the fulfillment just kind of stays there, and you have to figure out the next ways to grow, to develop, as a culture and stuff. So you can reap the same rewards of those people in that idyllic setting just by, again, setting out a more ideal version of your setting and yourself or your family or wherever you may be, and then making progress towards it. I mean, I really think that's what lies at the heart of human satisfaction with life, right? So yeah, and you said you just ordered it on Amazon. Highly recommend it. I'm not going to read this whole book. These first 2 chapters are just so potent that I wanted to really get into them this way. But I'm glad that this is leading people to get it for themselves. Like, this is like my second time through this book, and I'll probably revisit it in the future as well. It's just that potent. All right, let's see what we can do to wrap this up. I'm just going to make sure that we touch his last, most potent points. He starts getting into us as seeing ourselves as consumers. So let's read a little bit of that, because he's going to give us this transitioning us as thinking of ourselves as consumers to seeing ourselves as producers. All right. If, for instance, one is aware of the abuses and extortions to which one is subjected as a modern consumer, then one may join an organization of consumers to lobby for consumer protection legislation. But in joining a consumer organization, one defines oneself as a consumer merely. And a mere consumer is by definition a dependent, at the mercy of the manufacturer and the salesman. If the organization secures the desired legislation, then the consumer becomes the dependent not only of the manufacturer and salesman, but of the agency that enforces the law, and is at its mercy as well. The law enacted may be a good one, and the enforcers all honest and effective. Even so, the consumer will understand that one result of his effort has been to increase the number of people of whom he must beware. The consumer may proceed to organization and even to legislation by considering only his rights. And most of the recent talk about consumer protection has had to do with the consumer's rights. Very little indeed has been said about the consumer's responsibilities. It may be that whereas one's rights may be advocated and even served by an organization, one's responsibilities cannot. It may be that when one hands one's responsibilities to an organization, one becomes by that divestiture irresponsible. It may be that responsibility is intrinsically a personal matter, that a responsibility can be fulfilled or failed but cannot be got rid of. If a consumer begins to think and act in consideration of his responsibilities, then he vastly increases his capacities as a person, and he begins to be effective in a different way, a way that is smaller perhaps and certainly less dramatic, but sounder and able sooner or later to assume the force of example. All right, so this is such a good point for how we should actually act towards this, because you see the problem with this is that a lot of people, we identify ourselves as consumers, and so once you're confronted with these problems, you're like, like my rights are being violated, and this needs to be solved, right? So what's our solution? So we go to legislation, or we organize a nonprofit to fight for our rights to have these things better done for us. But even if we succeed, right, even if we convince people, we get the legislation in place, the government now starts acting different, we're still beholden to those other things in order to bring about these things for us, right? And so instead, he says, turn that from thinking of yourselves in terms of what your rights are with this to what your responsibilities are, and you instantly have more sovereignty over it, because then you see in terms of yourself, what you're responsible for and how you can act as well, that you maintain that sovereignty over this situation. I mean, that's why the last thing I would ever think of in order to make the world better would be to lobby something, protest something, go to government and unless there was restrictions in the government prohibiting me from doing things, such as the whole world of meat, for example, and producing local meat is thoroughly roadblocked by legislation that has been put in place to make meat safe at these grand feedlot scales that we have, but it prohibits small people like me from being able to raise animals, butcher them, and go put them in a store right in front of me, and for people to come and eat the healthy, good, well-raised, beautiful meat that I could raise. You can't do that unless you take your meat to a place with a government inspector that's there full-time to inspect the slaughter, etc., which even taking your animals to such a facility is going to mess up the meat because they're stressed, because you're having to move them off the home that they've always had and whatnot. So here's me getting on a little tangent, but it's to show you that in order to make this world better in the way that he's suggesting, the last thing you should do is to try to get other people to make it so. Although I just gave an example of how a lot of things in the world are roadblocks to making this happen. And those things I plan on going to and getting involved in local government processes to saying, look, these laws are prohibiting people from living in the most healthy way, and we got to get rid of them in these ways, or whatnot. And so, there's kind of both sides of that coin. But in the end, I love his take on maintaining your sovereignty, saying this is something I have a responsibility to solve, not other entities, etc. Because then you preserve the ability to act. That's the sad thing of so many of these protest movements in the world right now, is the very nature of it is that the problem cannot be solved unless somebody else solves the problem, not the people in the protest movement, right? And so they're slaves, they are beholden to the people that they are expecting to act. And that is never how I would approach solving a problem, because right there you have given away your sovereignty. Okay, what has not been often said, because it did not need to be said until fairly recent times, is that the responsible consumer must also be in some way a producer. Out of his own resources and skills, he must be equal to some of his own needs. The household that prepares its own meals in its own kitchen with some intelligent regard for nutritional value, and thus depends on the grocer only for select raw materials, exercises an influence on the food industry that reaches from the store all the way back to the seedsman. The household that produces some or all of its own food will have a proportionally greater influence. The household that can provide some of its own pleasures will not be helplessly dependent on the entertainment industry, will influence it by not being helplessly dependent on it, and will not support it thoughtlessly out of boredom. The responsible consumer thus escapes the limits of his own dissatisfaction. He can choose and exert the influence of his choosing because he has given himself choices. He is not confined to the negativity of his complaint. He influences the market by his freedom. This is no specialized act, but an act that is substantial and complex, both practically and morally. By making himself responsibly free, a person changes both his life and his surroundings. It is possible, then, to perceive a critical difference between responsible consumers and consumers who are merely organized. The responsible consumer slips out of the consumer category altogether. He is a responsible consumer incidentally, almost inadvertently. He is a responsible consumer because he lives a responsible life. And that's where I'm going to stop. It's not the end of the chapter, but he goes back into the Sierra Club to close things out, and I think it's a little unnecessary. So I think those things that we ended on, sum up this all nicely as to what you and I should do on it. And again, he gives these great examples, because he says even the act, let's say if you eat out, half of your meals right now, or even when you eat, if you are mostly on prepared foods, packaged foods, even the very act of changing and saying, I'm going to make 90% of my meals now, and when I make them, I'm going to use only stock from scratch ingredients. You're basically shopping on the periphery of the supermarket, and then also getting things like grains or wheat from inside, or basic ingredients like that. Even the act of doing that as a person exerts its influence on the whole process, right? Because you're rejecting the food products, the food science, stuff that's been put together, and you're influencing the way that the whole industry will act. Of course, you can go a lot farther by that, and the more you can raise your own food, the better. And then food's just one component of these things that we rely on as far as specialists. There's all these other ways that you can say, what do I rely on as far as specialists in my life? My daughter just came in and said shh to me. I guess it's time to be quiet for some reason. But anyway, what do you rely on as far as specialists, and what could you do to, instead being a consumer of those specialists, start turning yourself into being a responsible producer of your own needs and sovereignty? And the minute you do, just in little ways, you immediately feel more fulfilled, less helpless, etc. And you start to reap the rewards already, even though you may have a long ways to go, as all of us do, including myself, in terms of ultimately having that kind of greater sovereignty over the basic things of life. And just to I see there's some more comments and things that we'll get to in just a second, but that's kind of where I always like to end things and think of things, is just how much more a beautiful world it would be than where most people in most ways have this kind of basic sovereignty over the basics of life, right? Food, shelter, clothing, etc. And I think it's possible even in our world today. There are enough of these kinds of resources. There is still enough land, if treated right, in different places in the world, that this can all be done as people adopt the value system and then work together, because this should never be a solo project. This should all be just as much about forming little communities of like-minded individuals working together to do these things. And you still maintain exchange in that, right? Like, I would much prefer a community where I didn't have to make my own shoes, right? And there was somebody that was, let's bring in the idea that expertise still definitely has its place. Maybe the ideal world would be that everybody has a broad general, everybody develops themselves as generalists and has that ability to see the world. And then maybe everybody has a little specialization of their own. And some people, the lesser amount of people, highly specialize, because experts are awfully useful once you've identified the right value system. An expert can be extremely useful. So this is a point that I'm glad that popped in there. To see the proper kind of way of structuring the world would be to have most people have a generalist approach to the world, a holistic approach to the world, maybe with a little specialty of their own. And then, there should still be room for specialists, so that once the generalists, once the wisdom, of either the community or of the very wisest individuals that are in charge of things, hopefully, identify what the problem is, then you can bring in that token specialist to help focus on that specific problem, right? But when all of us are specialists, nobody is around to actually identify what the basic values are, and then identifying the right specialist to bring in, if that makes any sense. So, all right, with that, I've said everything that I want to say, so I'm going to see what you guys have been saying on here. And again, this is your last chance to get in any questions or comments, and we'll wrap this up. Okay, so you got the name of the book. Yes, The Unsettling of America, Wendell Berry. And the other one, it's called Holistic Management. So a little explanation. The Unsettling of America is much more readable. Let's see, sorry, I'm getting this so it's not in the way there. Much more readable for a general audience. Very powerful writing. That's why I'm reading his, like this. This one is not powerful writing per se. It's written more almost like a business book. It deals a lot with his other main idea, which is how rotational grazing can be used in certain environments to change the nature of the environments to be less brittle or deserty and turn them more towards more kind of verdant and green type and bounteous, I guess, environment. So they're very potent ideas. Like there's some powerful stuff here, couched in, kind of not as inspiring writing, let's say. So just to kind of prepare yourself for what you might find in both of these, the Wendell Berry book is definitely the one that's just more powerful by the words and the presentation itself. Stefan says, what were the main reasons you think towards the drive in mass towards specialization? It seems to me that education, the money system, and bureaucratic structures play a role. Yeah, I think it's, yesterday, I think it's tied into yesterday as well, in that, the whole way that modern Western civilization developed, especially with the bringing in the New World, which we talked about yesterday, was that everything was focused on commercial growth, right? And a lot of our society has been premised on the economy growing, per se. And so the way that we've achieved that, I think, is that when you have a society of specialists, high efficiencies grow out of it, economic efficiencies. Your economy can grow substantially by dividing things up in the way we have, and having people have their jobs focused on specialist things. And because we've needed the economy to grow that way, it's naturally been by bringing in, making ourselves specialists, that we have continued to grow the economy and maintain what, again, I think Eric Weinstein has a good term for, embedded growth obligations. We've kind of structured the whole world such that if we don't build the economy, right, there's far too much debt that has been gone into, and far too many social services that we're now paying for, that if we don't grow, it will all fall apart, right? And so bringing in the specialists has been a natural part in order to do that. And then as that's happened, the consequences, the unintended consequences come in from having people specialize, which is people lose the ability to look holistically. And so everything even focuses more on that extractive model. How much can we extract from every process, every organization, from the landscapes, from the earth, in order to keep this economy growing, in order to maintain this way of life that we say that we want. So that's my account, at least, of how this occurs. And so the way out is that essentially you have to say, like, that notion of just a growing economy forever, it hasn't made us any more content or fulfilled in life, getting to the point where, we are freed from the monotony of having to raise our own food and work with our hands. And so we can do what? Come home and entertain ourselves. That has not made us more fulfilled and give us more satisfaction or better health or all that. And so the way out is to say that was never the answer, to focus everything on the commercial industrial economy. There are other values going on in the world, and we should look more, to the world as a much more cyclical place. We're just getting ourselves in regenerative cycles of being able to provide the necessary things of life: food, shelter, warmth, children, to perpetuate things. There is an inherent satisfaction just in that kind of, in essence, staying at one level of progress. Now, I also am about progress as well, but of course, not necessarily commercial progress, economic, growing the size of the stock market progress. But that's where, if you're in these regenerative cycles where you have the basics taken care of, food, shelter, warmth, love, relationships, you can focus on a progress that is more in the realm of, human progress, as far as who we are and how we are developing in terms of our development. Just like a child develops into an adult, I think humans can continue their development from, that adult into greater levels of being, per se. And so taking care of our basics and regenerative cycles makes it so I think that can become more of our focus, rather than, working some job to try to just add to our bank account as the thing that we're trying to grow. I mean, Adam Smith and that notion of the invisible hand, where everybody acts in their self-interest and it makes everyone better off, it worked to a degree, right? But not in other ways, not in the full sense of values. And that's why, I believe in markets, for example. Markets are great. but I don't believe in the basic premise that everybody just acting, in narrow-minded selfishness, specialization actually makes everybody better off. It does in some ways, it doesn't in others. So in that sense, I'm critical of the basic way that capitalism has played out today in society. Okay, and Martin says, land is expensive. One needs to first accumulate capital in order to start. Yes, and here's part of the problem, and that's one that I'm chewing on. I'm trying to think of, because as I explained yesterday, and as Wendell Berry says, that's one of the things that's driven people off of the land, is that the next generation, the land increased because the economy, that's the burden of growing an economy. Things become more expensive, such as land, the capital, so that the next generation can't actually afford to live on the land in the same way that their parents did, and have even the basics of life in terms of the money, right? And so that's where we have to stop valuing things in terms of this imaginary money, and start valuing things in terms more of tangible values and the other kinds of value, human values, and less these these financial values. And again, I know that's not creating a solution. Okay, well, how does that get people land and whatnot? But that's where, like, at the end of the day, we have to kind of figure out a way to exit this system and the way of looking at it. Otherwise, we're just stuck in it, where anytime anybody sells a piece of land, they're saying, well, I've just got to sell it at what the market demands, and if it's up here, it's up here, and we just kind of act like that has to be the case. Why? Because we value the money, and in essence, we have to stop valuing that money, and it would, or something else. Like, that's one to chew on. But you're very right in that is a huge burden on the system. Although, again, still not impossible. There are still places, this may take moving to other places of the world, or you have to kind of explore the little nooks and crannies of whatever country you're in. There are still places where land is accessible, it's cheap. It may be more difficult land because it may not have exactly the resources that you need, but that's where some of our human progress and technology and just innovative thinking does come in. You figure out some way to generate more food or whatnot on a land that has less water, for example, that makes it cheap, or something like that. Because again, there is land still out there in places in the world, but it needs people to approach it with a determination, I guess you could say, and some smarts and some studying in order to know the best way to still be generative on that land. And then the cool thing is, like, this is Alan Savory's point, is that a lot of our less productive land, with the right systems, such as grazers like sheep and goats, can actually be turned to more productive land, even with less water. So, just at least some hope there, although by no means is it difficult. And you're right that underlying it all is the fact that land has become much too expensive, because of the way that the economy is always having to grow. Okay, looks like we've reached the end of our comments and questions today. So I hope this was also, again, useful. We're not just going to go and read this whole book, even though it's a potent book, but these first two chapters were especially good, and I wanted to just read his words word for word so you guys get acquainted with his words, because it turns out he's written like 50 books, and a lot of them are poetry as well. So this guy, he is impressive. Wendell Berry, again, he was a farmer. He's still living. I doubt he's doing much farming these days, but he lived what he taught, and then had a great mind and a great creative ability as well. So hopefully I've kind of whetted your palate for more Wendell Berry, and at least brought out some of his more potent ideas to be in our minds now. I have said that I'm going to be producing something by the end of this week. At this point, I've been a bit under the weather these last few days and not been as productive as I wanted to be. So I am still going to be getting something out, but it's probably not going to be a movie video essay. So I'm going to have to just kind of surprise you with what comes out. But I'm still going to maintain that commitment of getting some finished, more polished piece of of content out by the end of the week. All right, thanks for being here today. This is Gary signing out from Mission Top. Hope to see you back next time.